Hello, Geir. Thank you so much for coming along today. It's amazing to see you. For those who are not familiar with yourself and with your work, how would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Thanks for having me. Yes, my name is Geir Sigurdsson. I'm a professor of Chinese studies at the University of Iceland. I have my academic training is actually in philosophy mostly. I did my BA in philosophy and sociology here at the University of Iceland, and then I went to Ireland, University College Cork, and did my MA in philosophy there, and later I went to University of Hawaii and did my PhD there, where I focused in particular on Chinese philosophy. And during my PhD studies, I also spent a couple of years in China, in Beijing, where I learned Chinese and studied Chinese. And since then, since 2007, I've been employed here at the University of Iceland. I have constructed the Chinese studies program here, but my research focuses in particular on Chinese Western comparative philosophy. So most of my writings have been in that field. I have one book in English on Confucianism, and I think I have mostly focused on Confucianism, but also Taoist writings, and try to put them in some kind of dialogue with Western philosophy as well. So I guess that's more or less sums me up in a few words.
That is so incredible, and this project is kind of aspiring to go around the world virtually, from the comfort of my home in London, and converse with people from around the world. But you have quite literally gone around the world to pick up these ideas and to explore philosophical ideas.
Well, I believe that philosophy should not be limited to the Western world. Definitely isn't. There is philosophy in all cultures of the world, and I think this is a kind of a wisdom that should be accessible to everyone in the world, so we can learn from the experience of our different cultures and try to construct a better world on its basis. That's sort of my idea. Now, of course, there is a kind of a debate, ongoing debate going on whether there is philosophy in China, and I think it's actually a sort of a waste of time to discuss that. Of course, there is philosophy in China. It's just very different, and maybe is constructed on somewhat different basis than Western philosophy. But I think if we just keep our eyes open, our minds open, we can learn so much from that, and that should be the point.
So what would you say opened your mind, opened your eyes to this exploration of philosophy in the first place? How did you approach this?
Yeah, I think it was probably through literature. I used to read when I was young. I read a lot of literature, especially Russian literature, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Lermontov, Gogol, and they all seem to be asking questions, somehow pressing questions that really spoke to me, that had to do with, well, what to do with one's life, where to take it from there, and when you're a young person, of course, you're living in a kind of a continuous crisis in a way, because you don't know where to go, what to do, especially if you are very privileged. Like I consider myself to have been very privileged. I've never been poor, and I had the opportunity to educate myself. In other words, I had choices, but the choices, they produce crises, right? Because you have to choose, and then you have to ask yourself, on what basis am I choosing this, and how can I make up my mind, and so on. So it has to do with meaning, maybe, the meaning of life, direction of life? Where is the limit of the permissible? also, you know, how do we live with other people? How do we treat other people? And so on. And I think, yeah, especially the Russian masters, they were really dealing with that. And I guess also the sort of subjective feeling of the absurd, maybe, you know, that you realize that you are actually unnecessary. You know, I mean, you are contingent, really. I mean, if you didn't exist, it wouldn't matter that much in the world. And I think that's also, especially for a young person who is really in need of his or her own sort of self-importance. That realization is a kind of a shock, you know. You actually realize that you are contingent, you know. And what does that mean for you in life? And so this led me to other authors, more maybe academic, philosophical authors, such as, but also writers, you know, like Sartre, Camus, of course, with his notion of the absurd, of alienation, and so on. I mean, I remember reading the Outsider, L'étranger by Camus, and I was it just blew my mind, you know. It was a very strong piece of work. But I guess I also didn't understand it well enough, you know. And later I learned that Camus probably meant it as a kind of a parody of the person who is a nihilist, you know, and has no values or no sense of meaning. And it actually describes a kind of an impossibility in a way, you know. It's not possible to live in this way, you know. It's a contradiction in terms. And I read his Myth of Sisyphus, which is an incredible book as well. It's, you know, as incredible as it is short, you know. It is very short, very accessible, but it's so strong. And what I was always quite fascinated about in that book was when Camus says, you know, Sisyphus, you know, he's the guy who's rolling that rock, you know, up the hill all the time, you know, which is really, you know, a kind of a, I mean, it's of course a Greek myth expressing our daily tasks, you know, that we have to do every day. And then the rock just rolls back down and you have to start from anew. And that's how it goes every day. I mean, today is Monday, you know, and I woke up with my wife and, you know, and she would say something like this, you know, oh, another Monday, you know. I mean, it's always the same, you know, that happens over and over again. But then Camus says, and that's the striking part, you know, when Sisyphus is walking down the hill, you know, looking for his rock, he is, you know, he's looking at the hills and at the landscape and, you know, and he's happy, you know. It's not so bad. It's all right. I mean, he is able to find meaning in this activity that may strike the reader as being completely meaningless, you know, but it isn't, you know. And so, so from there, yeah, I've been exploring so many different authors. I mean, it would probably take me an hour just to mention them, but poets, Giacomo Leopardi, Fernando Pessoa, even E.E. Cummings. You know, I mean, these kind of thinkers who manage somehow to find the magic in the moment, you know. And they of course, I mean, what do? We create that magic, you know. The moment is there for us to grasp and to make it somehow beautiful or interesting or magical, yeah, right. And I have in my own work, I have in particular focused on the everyday, ordinary things, you know, the quotidianal sort of experience that we have in every day, and how we can actually take those moments and make them into something special, because these moments are this is the substance we are working with in trying to create meaning in our lives. And so that takes me to maybe many different kind of perspectives. I mean, one of the perspectives is of course the Nietzschean one. I mean, that we could say that that's probably the perspective that I start with in a way, and that's the perspective that demands or requires some kind of metaphysical foundation for everything we do. You know, some kind of meaning, some kind of meaning that is somehow independent of us, located in a world beyond the senses, or something like that. It's something like the Platonic world of forms, or maybe Christian heaven, or something like that. But I think most philosophers in the Western part of the world have somehow assumed that there has to be this sort of frame of reference, you know, that can establish this meaning. And Nietzsche, of course, I think he opens our eyes to the fact how important this element has been in Western thought, but that it's not sustainable, really, you know. And he is simply pointing to the fact that people don't believe this anymore. They are incapable of believing this now, to a large extent. Not everyone, of course. And that produces a certain crisis. But then he goes also beyond that in the construction of his philosophy that is really having to do with you know, creation or creativity, that it's actually really up to us to do this. And it's not easy at all to do it, but this is what we have to do, is to find a way to create meaning in our lives, because it's not going to be given to us, you know. It's really up to us. One of the things that when I started reading Chinese philosophy, I was really, really struck, you know, by the lack of this need in Chinese philosophy. You know, it doesn't really matter which Western philosophy you read, you always find this sort of yearning for some kind of metaphysical foundation, you know, that you have to have this foundation, that there has to be some kind of meaning that is established. No, I'm not talking about 20th century philosophy, I'm talking about earlier philosophy. But you read the old Chinese masters, you know, of course, in particular, perhaps the Taoist thinkers, 4th century BC, you know, Zhuangzi. There is no need of this sort of foundation. You know, it's something that you simply created in the moment, or there is an assumption that the world is inherently meaningful. You know, life is inherently meaningful, and it's really just our task to really enjoy what it has to offer, to make this existence that we have been given, to make it as enjoyable as possible. So we could say that, you know, instead of if we take, say, Heidegger's formulation of thrownness, you know, that we are being thrown into the world, you know, and suddenly we have to do something with this. But that seems to, you know, lead to some kind of dread, you know, or at least anxiety and fear and something like that. But in the Zhuangzian sense, it's a gift, you know, it's a gift. It's like being invited to this incredible party. You know, what do? You're not going to be anxious. You're going to be happy. You know, you're going to do something about it, do something with it. And I think that's very liberating, actually. Now, I think you can definitely find these perspectives in other authors, Western authors, but I think in particular they are maybe poets, you know, like I mentioned E.E. Cummings, you know, or Pessoa. There is a sense of humor, you know, also that is attached, I think, to this sort of perspective. That is very important. Humor is very important. That I mean, maybe to speak with Nietzsche again, I mean, that we realize that we are contingent, you know, but that can also be very funny in a way. And it can also liberate us, you know, it can be liberating to realize, I mean, in a way, if there is no metaphysical meaning, that can be quite terrifying, but it can also be liberating, you know. It depends on how you look at it. Same with this contingency thing, you know. Okay, so I wasn't created for any specific purpose. Good, I'm free. I can do whatever I want, more or less. But then, of course, we come back to the ethical questions, Dostoevsky and others. But I think, and I think I've learned from, my 50 years, more or less, that the ethical questions, those are also very, very interesting questions. And of course, when you're young, you want to get some kind of logical answers to those questions. You know, why do I need to be ethical? I mean, Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment, you know, Raskolnikov kills the old woman simply because he can. He is able to do it, you know. And then, of course, in the Karamazov brothers, where they say, if God doesn't exist, anything is allowed, you know. I mean, that sort of thing. I mean, that's the kind of problems that appeal to the young person, because the young person wants to get some kind of definite answers to these questions. Why should I be ethical? But what you learn through experience is that ethical has to do with constructing a society, to, you know, live with other people, live in harmony with other people, to be emotionally attached to other people. And we are simply that sort of creatures that we need it. And it's been proven, it's been demonstrated that people who are isolated or alienated and don't have a sense of belonging or sense of living with other people, these people don't live very long. I mean, they are almost like plants that get no water. They will just wither up and die. So the ethical question is something that gets answered as we get more experience with other people. Of course, this was recognized, I think, by philosophers in ancient times. I mean, Aristotle pointed this out, that we are simply social creatures. We need that. And so I think that sort of takes care of the ethical question. Now, of course, I mean, I sometimes watch TV and I listen to politicians who only seem to think about making money, and I feel so sorry for them. You know, if this is really what their values are about, then I think it's very impoverished, you know. And I find it very sad that somebody has lived maybe 40, 50, 60 years and still hasn't managed to develop his or her imagination well enough to understand that life is about something else than money, you know. Yeah, sorry, that was a long monologue.
No, not at all. Like you make me realize why I live with a perpetual headache, because philosophy just covers everything, doesn't it? It just, and you've just so beautifully and eloquently covered so much of it there. So much is standing out for me. But I guess my first question in response to that is, have you spent enough time with people in the communities of different cultures to be able to share whether you feel the philosophies of the different cultures, would you say that they impact the way of being, the way of approaching life of the communities in those cultures?
Yes, I think so. And of course, I mean, the most striking difference is living in China, you know, I mean, because it's a very different culture. So you notice, you know, immediately that it's different. But of course, cultures are complicated, you know, and they are not only determined by the underlying philosophies, but also history, recent experience, tragedies, traumas, all kinds of things, obviously. But for instance, in China, what strikes you, I mean, maybe it sounds like a cliche, but what it strikes you is how important is the sense of family there, and I used to have a Chinese wife also, so I was a part of a Chinese family in a way, and I found this to be somewhat stronger than you normally find in the West. The ties between family members are very, very strong, and the roles you play. I mean, I think that's a kind of a reflection of say the Confucian philosophy. If you, for instance, I mean, obviously, Chinese people today would probably not identify with the Confucian philosophy. The thing is that Confucianism has been criticized very heavily in the 20th century by the authorities, and it's been, I mean, during the Maoist era, Confucianism was a taboo thing. I mean, nobody was supposed to be a Confucian. But obviously, it's a part of sort of sedimented culture. The values that you find in Confucianism are there, even though people may not express them explicitly. But so I would say that there is this sort of role philosophy. We could say that if you are trying to understand who you are, and here you have a big difference between, I think, the Western sort of, at least the tendency in the West, is that we think about ourselves as kind of atomic selves, right? So when we are young, I mean, when I was young, and you want to get to know who you are, you're looking for yourself, right? What do you do? I don't know. I mean, you go in search for yourself somehow. Maybe you try to find activities that appeal to you and see if they are in line with your own motivations or something like that. So you find yourself in those activities. Maybe that's what you do. There's nothing wrong with this. It's all right. But I think in China in particular, you will tend to look for yourself in a different way, and it rather has to do with your roles. So when you are growing up within a family, I mean, this is how you learn to become a human being, in a way. So I mean, the first role you have is of a daughter or a son, right? So you have parents or at least your significant others who are taking care of you, and you somehow learn to live this role as the child, and then perhaps sibling, and then of course later on you will become a parent, and you will also be taking care of your parents, so the role will be reversed in a way, and of course then you have a job as well, so and you will probably get a spouse and so on. But all these are different roles, and what you are is basically just a collection of all these roles, So when you are trying to become a better person, what do? And I think this is kind of problematic in a Western context, because we don't really know how to work on that, because it's too abstract. When we are dealing with an atomic sense of self, we don't know what to work on in particular when we want to improve ourselves. But in the Chinese context, it's very clear, it's very concrete, If I want to make myself a better person, what do? I try to improve how my relationship with my wife, or I try to improve my relationship with my friends, or I try to become a better teacher, to treat my students better, or so on and so on. And when I do that, if I improve my performance in all these roles, that means that I am cultivating myself. I am becoming a better person. But I think implicitly, you also create meaning in existence simply by focusing on those particular roles and trying to deal with them in a better fashion. So yeah, maybe in this sense, it's a kind of it sort of prevents these existential crises from popping up. At least they don't seem to be as serious. Now, I don't want to paint this in a too rosy picture. Of course, it's also complicated to be Chinese, also because there are many expectations, and the roles can be very demanding, as well. So they can go too far as well. But I think that this is something that we can learn from. That we can maybe start thinking, instead of thinking of ourselves always as atomic selves, we should rather think about ourselves as social selves, embedded selves within a society. And it's really impossible to get any kind of understanding of who we are if we don't take into account the relationships that have shaped us and continue to shape us. So we have to think about ourselves as being a part of a network of other people. And it makes no sense to think of ourselves as atomic, because we are not. I mean, I cannot think about myself without thinking about my family, my friends, even my students and colleagues, and so on. I mean, this is all these people. They help shape what I am. And I couldn't really think about myself without all these people who have had so much influence and continue to have a lot of influence on me. And I think it's a much healthier way to think about who we are, to think about think about us as being a part of a social network. I'm not talking about Facebook here, although it could also be a part of it.
I think it's such a valuable point you make there about the different ways we can approach it, changing ourselves, improving ourselves, or developing ourselves, whether it is looking at our self and in almost an isolated way, or looking at how we're making contributions to society, to the people that are around. And I feel actually that because I work as a psychotherapist, some
Yes.
of the greatest suffering comes from when we are purely focused on our self. It's
Yes.
almost impossible to feel that level of pain and isolation and sorrow when we are engaging in a meaningful way with another person, when we're supporting another person. It can alleviate so much.
Yeah, exactly. There is this, I mean, alienation, the sort of feeling of solipsism, of having to deal with all your difficulties by yourself. I think that's what triggers this incredible unhappiness, and I think we have to get away from that. I mean, obviously, it's important also to enjoy solitude to some extent. I think it's also healthy. And going back to Aristotle, it's very interesting because Aristotle, he speaks of the good life, but there is a kind of a tension in the way he presents it, because he says the best life is a kind of a reasonable activity when we are engaged in constructing the social sphere with other people. So we are engaged in political activity, participating in trying to improve our society. But then he also talks about contemplation, sort of solitary contemplation about maybe metaphysical issues or something like that. And he would say this is also, and this is another way to have a good life. And the way I have understood it is that you need maybe a mix of both, because it can also be too much to be surrounded with people all the time, at least at least for me. I need my solitude once in a while as well, and I think that's just sort of healthy also to maybe yeah, contemplate your position maybe vis-a-vis other people. Yeah.
Finding that balance, isn't it? Finding that balance of what works for you.
Well, yes, finding that balance. But I think it's also very important to understand that it's not a balance that you can find once and for all. It's something that you just have to be working on all the time. You have to think about it all the time. There's no way that you can find it once and for all. And I think it's the same thing sort of applies to how you construct meaning in life. Because that's not going to happen once and for all. No way, you know. I mean, you have to be, you need to be very interpretive all the time, you know, and actively try to sort of pull the beautiful elements of existence out of it, you know, and because it's not going to happen on its own, really. You have to do it. I mean, we have to do it. We are creative beings. That's what we are. We have language. We have, of course, very refined senses, ways of expressing this beauty that we do in writing, in songs, in poetry, and so on. And we have to make use of these creative abilities to simply, well, beautify our world and our reality. It's really just up to us. But it has to be done. It has to be done all the time. I think it's actually possible, perhaps, to develop a kind of a habitual way of seeing things in that way, so that you kind of do it automatically. But it still needs to be done in a more or less conscious way. And we should not wait for meaning to reach us, because it's not going to reach us. You know, we have to make it. We have to find it. We have to create it, and we can do it. That's the thing. That's why I also say, you know, a sense of humor is also very important, because we also have to realize, you know, that, and sometimes I also, I mean, obviously I can also be depressed sometimes, but what helps me going through that depression is also this sort of humorous side of the meaninglessness of things, you know. Things are really, you know, so ridiculous sometimes. We find ourselves sometimes in very ridiculous situations, and we can also be very ridiculous, you know, ourselves, and often it can somehow make us understand, well, maybe it's not so serious after all, you know, and there's no need to cry over this. I'm not you know, saying that I can take everything so lightly. I mean, I've gone through divorces and stuff which are very painful and take a long time to heal from. But I think this sense of contingency is helpful somehow in overcoming those problems, and maybe put them into perspective somehow. You know, that we are of course living in time. You know, it's not something we cannot avoid. Time is always moving. Things are always changing, and if we simply allow time to do what it does best, which is just to move, things will always be different, you know, from what they seem to be now. So we need to be often patient and so on, but this realization that things will not stay the same, nothing stays the same, everything is always changing. And that means that we always have to be somehow alert as well to those changes.
And I feel so much suffering comes from a sense of resisting that change, the fact that things are changing and the changes themselves. When we
Absolutely.
resist that and we become like perpetually anxious about change, and we're fearful of everything that approaches us, but when we can embrace that natural fact that everything will be changed, and we can, like, I love how you're really emphasizing how it's this creative, life is this constant creative process. We
Yeah,
can create,
I
yeah.
think it's what you mentioned is actually the crux of Buddhism, and Buddhism also has a lot to offer. I mean, there's no surprise that Buddhism has become fairly popular in the Western parts of the world as well, especially Zen Buddhism. But that's really, I mean, the foundation of Buddhism is that, the what generates this unhappiness is the attachment to things and to people. And this is something we need to overcome. That we have this image in our head that things have to stay the same, and if we lose these things, then we will be unhappy. And we just have to get rid of that image, and that doesn't mean, sometimes when I've taught Buddhism, then my students will ask, so does it mean that we are not supposed to love people? And I said, no, this is not what it means at all. I mean, it's for instance that say my wife, yeah, my wife is always changing. She is not going to be the same person that I met 12 years ago. She will be different, and that's something that I have to accept. I have to change with her, and not expect that she always stays the same, because it's impossible, and it's not going to happen. So in this sense, you have to let go of these attachments, that things are supposed to be the way you want them to be. No, you have to be more flexible than that, and that's somehow the key to accepting simply the ways function in the world, and they cannot be otherwise. But if you don't do that, then you are always yearning for some kind of a world that doesn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
and you will be frustrated.
Mm-hmm. And that factors for the world itself, for the people in our social world, but also for ourselves. And I think that's it, is that we become familiar with an identity, with a role, like you were saying earlier, and when that role, it no longer is compatible with the place and time that we are. You're speaking about development and change there, and it is absurd for us to think that what entertained us and gave us joy as a tiny child would be the same as it is now.
Precisely. Yeah. And I think we actually constantly experience this in a way when, I mean, for instance, in the, say, movies or something like that, that we watched when we were kids or younger, maybe not even kids, maybe just young people, and I remember having watched some movies that I found amazing when I was in my 20s, and then I watched them again and I was like, what? Why did I find this interesting? Because we are, of course, always changing, so even though we are, of course, in some sense the same person, but we have just become so different, and we don't realize it ourselves. I think we only realize it when we are maybe engaged with things from the past that had a certain impact on us then, and it doesn't work anymore because we have become very different from what we used to be. Same applies to books. I remember, actually, speaking of existentialist books, I read at the time Camus' The Plague, when I was a young man. And then now, when the pandemic was beginning, I decided to read it again. And I went through it, but I didn't like it very much, actually. There was something, it just didn't speak to me very much, But I remember the impressions I had at the time. They were very strong, There was some kind of heroic element in it that I found much less impressive today. So it's interesting. It was surprising, actually. a little bit maybe disappointing, but but of course it's just something you have to accept.
And also, like you were saying right at the beginning, this this openness to philosophies and to messages. We at different points of our life there are different parts of our being, parts of ourselves that are open to different messages. We need to receive and find different messages at different times. And what
Yes.
can come and resonate with us from a movie or a book or a piece of music or a conversation with a friend or a video like this at one
Absolutely.
moment might be completely different to the next. If I rewatched each interview again and again and again, I'm sure I would take something completely different from each interview.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, you have become different. You are new in some ways. You have, well, I hope, I suppose you have enriched yourself, and that means that you can take more from your experiences than you were previously able to. I think this is what we call growth. You know, is that you have a better ability to positively construct your own environment from your experience. And I mean, I'm also very, very interested in education. In fact, my book on Confucianism really focuses on education or learning from a Confucian point of view. And I think that's something that we in the West can also learn very much from. Of course, we also have our very strong traditions in this regard. And I placed it in some kind of dialogue with that, with the sort of humanistic traditions that we have, and the understanding of education as a sort of a process of humanization, that, you know, we are humanizing ourselves, you know, we are becoming more persons, more human through education. Like many, of course, people engaged in the educational industry, I'm very worried about the strong tendency that we have today of thinking about education only as a kind of a technical training for jobs, you know, or for the economy. I think we have to think about education in a much broader way than that. We should be thinking about it precisely as kind of a process of humanization or becoming more human. And that means simply expanding our capacities, you know, for constructing a better society where everyone can live decently. So, so I mean, education is also very important, I think, from an existential point of view, because it's education that enables us to lead a better life and understand our place in society and the importance of taking also care of other people, because we are social creatures. Unfortunately, I think this is this view is probably not so strong in education today.
Why do you feel that that's the case?
Well, I think there are pressures, you know. I mean, I'm at a state university, and we are, of course, a very important university in Iceland. You know, Iceland is very small, as you know. We only have 340,000 people, and this is by far the largest university in the country. We have about 15,000 students, which is proportionally quite large. And of course, because we are a state university, we serve different roles. I mean, obviously, we are producing people for the economy. Obviously, I mean that's inescapable. But we are also a national university, so we have the only humanities department and so on. And we are, of course, supposed to take care of our heritage, culture, you know, Icelandic, and so on and so on. But I can feel since I began working at the university, which is what, 14 years ago now, I feel that there is always a growing pressure from the industries that we should be serving them. And I also feel that many students are much more worried about their job opportunities than they used to be. And what I would like to say to students is don't think too much about the job opportunities, because I think if you really have a passion for what you are doing, if you are doing something that you really enjoy doing, the jobs will come. They will present themselves for sure. I think there is nothing, well, okay, maybe that's going too far, but there are, it's very, very sad to see a person who is going through some kind of education that he or she hates, just to do a job that he or she hates all her life, only to make money. I mean, man, I mean, I find that really, really, really sad, that we have, and that's what I often tell people, or my students and others. Not everyone agrees perhaps, but I will say we only have this one shot, we have this one life, one existence, and if we are lucky, we might be able to stretch it to 80 years, maybe even beyond that. It's not a very long time, so try to make the most of it, try to make use of that time in such a way that you enjoy what you're doing, at least. So coming back to that metaphor of the party, try to enjoy the party at least. I think many people they waste time, and I think we could actually, if we just thought a little bit more about the importance of accommodating everyone in our societies, we could build a much better society than the one. I mean, we're going into a kind of different issues here, but the idea of GDP and the ability to buy things, I don't know. I don't think this is the right way to go. And of course, we are also living in a world where environmental issues are becoming more and more important, and we really have to start somehow deconstructing the capitalist system so that we can actually both protect our planet, but also, I think, live much saner and healthier lives than we have, because now we are there's too much focus on consumption, and we don't need to consume this much. There are other things that matter more and are better, I think, for our lives. For instance, when we went through the economic crisis in 2008, what was very interesting is that many children turned out to be much happier. The reason was that their parents spent much more time with them during and after the crisis than before the crisis, when everyone was so busy in their careers and making so much money that the children were neglected. And I think, when you have this sort of society, there is fundamentally something wrong going on. That's something that we have to think about. So, okay, so I'm taking it to political issues as well. Sorry about that.
No, not at all, because I think it all feeds into itself, doesn't it? The pressures that being part of a capitalist society, the messages that you're given that you must consume, therefore you must get a job that allows you to consume, therefore you must get an education that allows you to get a job that allows you to consume. And where in that is you? And the emphasis
Absolutely.
that you put there on that, trust that if you spend that time on focusing on who you are and what is truly meaningful to you and the people around you and those connections, then you'll find your footing. You'll fall into a job and into a career that authentically fits with you. And if you spend enough time with yourself, you probably work out that the material things might be, a nice comfort. They might enable you to do different things, but they're not going to make you feel connected with the world or happy or valuable.
They can be a nice additional bonus, for sure. Absolutely, yeah. And I have nothing against material comfort. That's fine, but they should not be the first priority. Unfortunately, of course, especially young people today, I think they become a kind of victims of this way of thinking, because they have the impression that they have to go and get an education that will enable them to make a lot of money and so on. So they somehow get hurled into this this vicious circle. Poor guys. Instead of just choosing what they would like to do, maybe go to the Academy of Art, become an artist or something like that. And I always say, because we are a wealthy country, I mean, like the UK is a wealthy country, we have lots of opportunities. We can choose, we can do these things. It's different if you live in countries where there are fewer opportunities or very limited opportunities, I mean, all my sympathy with these people, but I think we of all people should make use of the fact that we can choose and we can live a good life, even though we are following our own dreams and our own hobbies. Like being an artist or something. You can live from that. It's quite possible. It's maybe more difficult in Bangladesh, but it's possible to do it in this part of the world. So I always try to encourage young people to do just that, instead of thinking about the job opportunities, because as I said, they will present themselves. And then again, of course, it also has to do with time, because things are always changing. And it's like the saying goes, people plan and God laughs, because we make all kinds of plans for the future, but things always change. They change dramatically, and one day you find yourself in a place that you could never have imagined that you would be some years earlier. I mean, I certainly can say this about me. I was never my plan, for instance, to focus on Chinese philosophy, really, but, just one thing led to another, and suddenly I was in Beijing, I mean, that's just the way it goes, So we shouldn't be too inflexible with our plans, Always, it's like John Dewey said. I think that all plans are preliminary. I think he said, that's exactly what it is, because that's how life works, and there's no way that we can just plan ahead and follow our plans in details, because things will never be the way we imagine, ever.
And I know we've covered some of these important existential themes, like, time and choice and freedom, but for people exploring existentialism, how would you define existentialism?
Oh, yeah, it's difficult to define it, but I don't know. I think it's a kind of an attempt to formulate or express the conditions of our existence, or something like that, I mean, it's this unspeakable sort of thing, I mean, to exist is, if you think about it, it's really amazing, that we should actually be, and just to be is something, it's so fundamental, but it's so difficult to say what that is, and so of course it is a kind of an attempt maybe to formulate the meaning of what it is to exist as a human being, obviously, not as a light post or something. I mean, human being is something else, because we have self-consciousness, and we have thoughts, and we have language, and so on. So I think this is the attempt, to somehow formulate those conditions and the meaning of existence, and then of course it leads us to explore, what sort of how can we express this meaning? What sort of meaning is there? And of course, as I said in the beginning, this has been then led through the trajectory of religion of, Christianity, of course, in particular, that provides us with meaning. It's very clear in Christianity that we exist, in order to fulfill our lives in heaven after this life. So this is simply a kind of an exercise for the real life that is supposed to take place after this one. But I don't think, well, I mean, there are people, of course, who take this seriously, quite a few, and I think maybe because they need to, maybe they require this sort of metaphysical reassurance that this is all for something, that this is leading to something. And I have nothing against religion, absolutely nothing. I think religion is fine. Religion is something maybe it's an expression of a very primordial human need, that you seek for something which is greater than you, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think it actually does a lot of good things. It gives people reassurance, comfort, and so on. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just I cannot accept it as such. I cannot accept this. The discourse offered, say, by Christianity, even though I have a lot of respect for many Christian values, and I find, for instance, Jesus to be quite a personality, and very interesting, even from an existential point of view. Is a very interesting personality. He's a radical, he came to change things, and to like he said, to fulfill the law inside of ourselves, that we should not be doing things simply because it's written, but because we feel the need to be ethical and relate to other people. I think it's quite possible to construct, and it probably has been done, to construct Jesus simply as a philosopher, without necessarily basing him on the Christian religion. So I have nothing against religion as such, but I felt the same, or at least when I started reading Nietzsche at the time, I felt that he spoke to me because I felt something very similar, that I am simply incapable of believing in this or accepting this worldview that Christianity presents itself. And then what? What do you do? Well, then you have to proceed from there. And I think this is, in fact, this is the kind of worldview that a lot of people, especially in the Western part of the world, are dealing with, and it can be very, very painful. I think maybe in particular for many young people who are unsure about themselves, and they will reject religion, especially Christianity. It's not fashionable, obviously, and parents may not be, religious either. So it's not really a part of their life as such, but that can actually create a crisis, because I think Nietzsche was right in saying that we still have a culture that somehow expects or requires this sort of metaphysical meaning, but then you have nothing to provide this anymore. It's gone, so you have to look for it somewhere else. And what do many people do in our Western part of the world? They look into other religions, right? So they will become I don't know, Buddhists or Muslims or take up some sects, or they construct their own sects even, or something. But that's basically doing the same. So you are just constructing another religion, because the Christianity cannot fulfill your wishes. Okay, so you look for another religion. But of course, what Nietzsche hoped, and what I think is also important, is that we should be able to live without it. At least some of us should be able to live without it, and that's maybe what sort of drives my own interest in this existential project. How do we do that? And in fact, I think actually literature is a much more interesting resource than maybe philosophy in this regard. And I think poetry, for instance, it can really be amazing. You read something that is contains 10 lines, and it just tells you everything somehow.
I really loved that you mentioned that, because that's something that I've noticed in my training, that there's obviously a strong emphasis on academia and on literature, and there's a limit to advocating the power of poetry and cinema and music, but the messages that they convey can be even more powerful than a huge, academic piece of work.
Yes, for sure. And it's so interesting with many poets who are, especially those who seem to have this sense, that they want to express maybe this wonder of existing somehow, and the more they mature, the more they grow, the shorter the poems become. And it's really quite valuable. Like Paul Celan, a German poet, amazing. His poems always became shorter and shorter, but the power of the expression was always stronger somehow. So yeah, it's a real art. It's very difficult kind of art. Is to deal, of course, with language, and it's probably much easier, to write a book of 300 pages, than trying to say everything in one poem.
Yeah, and I know we touched on it earlier, but have there been times where these messages, these philosophical messages, have helped you get through something tough in life?
Yes, for sure. Definitely. I mentioned earlier my divorces. I've had two. They were difficult. I mean, like, divorce is always difficult. There's always a lot of regret, when you go through something like that. And I don't know, maybe it's a kind of a sense of lost opportunities or something. And inescapably you are depressed and dejected somewhat, and even though, I mean, you may have wanted a divorce, but it's still painful. And so yeah, I mean, literature has helped me for sure, and especially, like I've mentioned more than once, the sort of existential kind of literature that also displays a sense of humor, so this this understanding that, well, okay, this is my divorce, or this is a difficult period I'm going through, but maybe after all it's not so important, and it's something that you can overcome, and things will change, and so on. So yeah, I think I've found solace mostly in that sort of literature and poetry. Zhuangzi's philosophy, the Chinese Taoist, is amazing. I mean, you read that stuff, and you just somehow, it's almost impossible not to feel happy. When you read that, there's just such joy of living there, and this creativity and sort of kind of a carelessness, the first chapter is called roaming without aims, or aimlessly roaming about, and that's very much a sort of a thematic element in Zhuangzi's thinking, is this roaming about, without strolling, without having particular aims, it's just being, and taking in everything that is in the environment and is worth exploring, or enjoying. And it's a kind of a consciousness that I always bring with me wherever I go. Well, I think it also helps, not to take yourself too seriously. I think that's very important, because there is no reason to take oneself too seriously. All we are individuals who are living for a short period of time, and then we cease living and we will never live again. And, but we are here now, and, and that's why we should try to make the most of it now. And then it will be gone. But of course, you can only make the most of it if you try to construct positive relationships with other people. I think otherwise it's not enjoyable. I know that sometimes means that you have to deliberately avoid certain people as well. You just choose your friends, and choose. I mean, there's not much that is more frustrating than being surrounded with negative people. It's difficult, and of course, some people, they have a problem there. I mean, they grow up in families that are dysfunctional and negative, and so on, and like we say, we cannot choose our family members, and we will have people in our families that are like that, and we somehow have to deal with that. That's it's a challenge, can be a real challenge. But I would say for most, for those who are really suffering in this way, that they should try as much as possible to be surrounded with positive people, because the others are not going to do very much for them. And it can be really, really difficult to be surrounded with that sort of people for a long time.
And the influence of others on how we're experiencing the world is just profound. It's so intense. Yes. And perhaps to the point that if we're not reflecting on that, then we're not necessarily aware of that. But I love how you emphasize the value of humor in situations, because I think especially I can't say for other areas, for other careers, but especially in the world of academia, people do take themselves so seriously.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that I don't take my job seriously and the role that
that's not what it means.
Of course, but just to take ourselves so seriously, I find myself comparing myself to other people, taking myself so seriously, and there is so little room for that laughter and that release, and that the fact that it is absurd, and we're just, like you say, we're just bumbling around.
We're trying to do our best, and hopefully we will be of some use, during this time, and that's basically what we're here for, both to enjoy and hopefully be of some use to other people, so that they can enjoy, and do our little bit in maybe constructing a better world. There's only so much we can do, obviously. I mean, we cannot save the world. Maybe that's another element from Chinese philosophy is the sort of focus on your environment. That's a very Confucian kind of way of thinking about it. That what the way for us to cultivate ourselves is to take care of our families, because that's our nearest environment, and the way for us to improve society is, the way for us to take care of our family is also to take care of our society, because the family is living within the society, and so you expand, and of course the main the final aim is to make peace in the world. That's how they formulate it, in the whole world, or in the empire or the world. It depends on how we interpret it. But the point is, that we have these concentric circles, of interacting, and each will, expand the impact, to other spheres, So when we we contribute to making our family more harmonious and better, it's going to contribute to a better society, and so on, so on. And of course, we also have this in Western philosophy. I'm thinking about Emmanuel Levinas, for instance, who says something very similar. He talks about, you know, the face, you know, and that we should first of all, we should think about the people in our own environment, you know, instead of trying to save the world, you know. And he has criticized people who, you know, who are all about, you know, saving someone in a distant part of the world while completely ignoring somebody who is suffering in your next door, you know, even, or in the next building. Because, I mean, it's sort of think locally, think globally, act locally, yeah, right, yeah. It's a kind of a global way of thinking, I suppose.
For someone that is kind of going through challenges at the moment and wanting to find support through watching this and through these ideas, what would you recommend for them?
Well, I'm not a therapist, you know. I found some years ago, I think there was a book that came out called Plato, Not Prozac, or something like that, where you may have looked at that. No? Okay. I can't remember the author's name, but if you check it out on Amazon, I think you will find it. Plato, Not Prozac. It actually got a lot of attention. I didn't read it. I read something about it. You know. So that was a kind of a move. I don't know how this has developed then, but there was a kind of a move to using philosophy as kind of therapy in you know, especially in the United States. You know, that's why the reference to Prozac, because I guess people take a lot of medical sort of opiates, you know, in the US. And so instead of taking those tranquilizers, you know, you should rather read Plato. I'm not sure if Plato is the right one, although he's not bad. But some of the, you know, I sometimes wonder about these authors that I have been referring to here, because I wonder if they are dangerous, you know, if you, because I've been describing to you how it affected me to read, you know, Dostoevsky and Camus, and of course they are talking about the meaninglessness and the absurd and so on, you know, and it's a difficult discourse, you know, it's difficult to face these things, but somehow how it presented itself to me, at least in the end, but it probably took some while, was that it was liberating in that sense, you know, and but it doesn't mean that it wasn't, I didn't go through a painful process, you know, while I was maybe digesting everything they had to say. But in the end, I found that the notion of ourselves as just being here temporarily, as having limitations and not having any kind of specific predetermined goals in life was very liberating, you know. The other thing can be suffocating in a way, you know, if you're told beforehand, you know, what you are supposed to do. But we have this freedom. Freedom is difficult to deal with because freedom, of course, includes so many choices, you know, and it's like when I ask my daughter, we go to a restaurant and I ask her, what do you want to eat? And she would, what? I have to decide, you know, that's crazy, you know. And it's a bit more serious, of course, in life. But so I'm not sure if I would be maybe hesitant in recommending that people are reading Nietzsche or Camus. But maybe, you know, poets like Fernando Pessoa, have you checked him out? Portuguese poet. Yeah, he's absolutely beautiful, you know. You find them in English translation. it's precisely this sense of not taking yourself too seriously and what you are doing, and also the emphasis on imagination. That we do have a lot of imagination that helps us, make things more interesting, to make the world more interesting. I mean, through imagination, we actually we can expand our world infinitely. Giacomo Leopardi was an Italian poet in the early 19th century. He was very, very depressed. He died very early. He was also sick during most of his life. But he wrote both incredible poetry, but also dialogues between very unlikely creatures, between animals, and between one is actually called Between Nature and an Icelander, which is quite funny. He never went to Iceland. But it's all about meaning of life, and it's basically all about the meaninglessness of life, that there is no meaning in all this stuff. I mean, it's a kind of a Nietzschean consciousness that he had before Nietzsche, I would say. But he was also, I think he read Schopenhauer, maybe. He was probably influenced by Schopenhauer to some extent. But he is very humoristic. He's very funny. And, he's so funny in the way he presents this meaninglessness. So you get this harsh truth, somehow, but it's formulated in such a fashion that you can only laugh. It's only funny. And this incredibly ingenious way of formulating this horrible truth somehow comes through in such a way that you realize it, but you also realize that that's okay. It's fine. It's not so serious. It's not so devastating as you perhaps would have suspected or feared beforehand. So, I mean, read poetry, especially those guys, or read E.E. Cummings. I mean, his beautiful love poems. I mean, how is it possible not to fall in love with life when you read his poetry? It's just amazing. It's also this sort of carefree, incredibly carefree, light way of thinking about things. I think it's important. But as I said, Natalie, I'm not a therapist, so I don't know what to do.
No,
sometimes I get students to come over. They come over and they come with their problems, and I don't know what I tell them. I try to respond to the problem in question somehow, but it's always difficult to recommend something to people. But and I certainly understand that life can be tough sometimes, and it's there are no easy ways out. I mean, that's something that we also have to accept and realize, maybe, that there are no easy ways out. And even though I may speak in this way, I may say, oh yeah, read this, read that, and everything will be fine. No, of course not. It's not so easy. But I think we, first of all, I think we need to find a good social environment. We need to be surrounded with positively minded people, constructive people, not destructive people, because there are far too many people, I think, who may be very unhappy themselves, and they seem to, it appears as if they get some kind of satisfaction out of undermining other people, maybe because of their own unhappiness or something like that. But we just have to try to avoid these people if possible, because we don't need that. I think life is a communal thing. We cannot go through the life by ourselves. We need other people to do that. So it's a communal project, so to speak. And for this we need the support of others, especially psychological mental support of other people.
And I'd love to add to that it's not necessarily about keeping, if you're feeling sad and if you're feeling negative, that's okay, that's inevitable. So it's
Yes.
not about cutting yourself off because you shouldn't be around people or never spending time with someone that's in pain, but perhaps being mindful about how you're feeling after an interaction with someone. There's a difference between kind of feeling negative and feeling in pain and producing negativity, giving out negativity.
That's right.
Yeah.
Precisely. No, of course. I mean, we shouldn't even try always to avoid sad feelings, because I think that's just a part of being a human being. That we both go through joys and sorrows, and we need to do that. I mean, that's a part of the experience of being human. Going back to Chinese philosophical sensibilities again, you have the yin yang philosophy, which is a kind of a sort of an underlying metaphysical conceptual foundation in a way, and that philosophy, or that, say, binary structure there, really takes for granted that we have to go through all kinds of extremes, in order to get a good sense of the harmony that we are looking for. If we don't know the opposite extremes, then we cannot find the balance either. So going through that, is healthy, and it's a part of, let's say, the process of humanization, of that education. But we also have to maybe process it into a real experience, and we have to make it into an experience by thinking about it and trying to learn from it, trying to, I mean, generally I would say that every experience can be a learning experience. It just depends on what we do with it.
Indeed, and a learning and potentially even a laughing one is one that I'm going to take from you here today. And for me, that's bringing up choice again. We can have an experience, whatever that experience might be. We can choose which kind of emotion we ride after that. Do we focus on how much that experience has hurt us, or do we put our energy into finding the humor in it, finding the learning from it? It's always our choice. We can always choose which position we take on pursuing that emotional kind of ride after that experience.
Yes, and I would say, in fact, that I think what people need to realize is that I think their own happiness or satisfaction in their life depends really much more on their own decisions than they may realize. It's really very much a matter of making that decision. And I know it's maybe difficult to get to that point, but this is I think we tend to think of ourselves far too often as kind of being passive victims of circumstances, and of course sometimes we are, because I mean there are circumstances that can be very constraining and so on, but there is always some leeway for negotiation, that we negotiate those constraints, and we can overcome so many things if we just decide to do that.
It reminds me what you were saying earlier as well about making choices which are genuinely exciting and interesting to us. If we continually take a subject and follow a career which doesn't have any excitement for us, how can we then later be shocked by the fact that we're not enjoying life? Whereas if we're continually, I might not make all the money from it, but right now I feel inspired by art, so I'm going to pursue art. At least you're then able to say, well, looking back, I followed what was right for me. And you're going to probably be more connected with yourself to be able to face the challenges which still are going to come, but at least they're coming in your genuine area, not in an area which you're not even passionate about anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I know
So,
you've spoken about this amazing kind of collaboration between different philosophies and all of these different countries and that you've had over your career. But what would you describe as kind of like your offering, as it were?
yeah, well, if I should sum it up, well, I think it's combination of various things that I have been mentioning. Obviously, I mean, one is this sense of education, and that we start trying to understand education in this way. What education can do for us as human beings, and also the power of interpretation, the power of construction that we actually possess as human beings, that we try to make use of our very human faculty of reason and imagination and interpretation of, that we are always engaged in interpretation every day when we are experiencing anything in our lives. We are always reading a book, so to speak, and obviously we cannot interpret it in any way we like, but we actually do have a lot of leeway, to interpret it in our favor. So, for instance, trying to make a positive spin on things, this is actually within our capacities to do that. So, so it has to do with empowering, maybe empowering us as individuals, but always socially embedded individuals who gain an understanding of themselves through their social participation. I think maybe these three strands is something that I could possibly present as my offering. And the fourth would be the humor, obviously, to see the comical aspects of things as well, to sometimes see ourselves as being participants in the theater of the absurd somehow, which of course life is in some ways.
Thank you so much for sharing today. I'm wondering, is there anything before we go that you would like to add?
No, there's nothing that I feel that I should add in particular. It was a very enjoyable conversation, and thanks for creating this moment. That was very nice. I hope it has been of some use. I'm sure I probably could have been better prepared in some ways, but it was a nice spontaneous conversation.
I think with these kind of conversations with people that have this, almost endless passion, these conversations can always be planned and prepared and extensively in different directions all the time. But perhaps that's the exact beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It's just continuous thinking, and there is no end to it.
Yes. Of course, it has to be continuous, and there is no, once and for all thing. We just always have to go on, and we live in a world that is constantly new as well. So we always have to adapt and readapt to this reality. I mean, that's basically the point of living as a human being, right? And it's much more complicated than with most other creatures, because our world is also a world of meaning. We need meaning, and if the meaning doesn't come to us, then we have to come to it. We have to create it. We have to construct it. That's our task as both individuals, but also as social beings.
And permit ourselves to, perhaps that's part of it. To allow ourselves to find the newness, to allow ourselves to see this new day as a new day, to allow ourselves to find the humor rather than to take ourselves so seriously, and to to continually question, am I living in a habitual way, or am I living, is there something that I want to change, and how can I change that to make it better for me and for those around me?
Although habits are not necessarily that bad,
Mhm.
and it just depends on what sort of habits we have. Yeah, we can of course go through things habitually, but unreflectively perhaps, and I think perhaps that's not so good. But we can also develop the habit of being sort of creative and imaginative in our interpretations, but also critical. We can being having a habit doesn't mean that we are going thoughtlessly through things. We can also have the habit of being very thoughtful about our environment, and I think this is what true education actually should do, is to create that sort of habits, good habits, critical, imaginative, and engaging. Be there, don't be absent.
I think that's just such a beautiful way to approach education, and I really hope that your journey and your quest to kind of spread that idea really does go far, because it's so valuable.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. I also wish you all the best of luck with your project.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to sharing it, and really look forward to being able to share your words with everyone too. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Natalie.